This is again Pranav Rao from Smartkarma's research team, and I'm pleased to introduce Sohee Park, the Chief Product Officer for Group Digital Investments and Technology at Ping An. So he joined Ping An after 17 years in global financial services at McKinsey, Hong Kong, and London, UBS London, and most recently as Managing Director at JP Morgan London. At Ping An, she heads the Digital and Economic Research Center and Group Investment Products, two P&L businesses in Group Investments and Technology, and her remit includes developing investment insights as well as digitizing and commercializing products using big data, AI, and cloud in Group Investments, which oversees USD 1 trillion of AUM. Sohee, great to have you on, and I believe you've got a few comments before we can get to Q&A.
All right, thank you very much for joining this session, and thank you very much for this introduction. So what I'm about to present is one of the research pieces that we've done for the group. We typically do not speak publicly about the research that we do for the group, which includes clients of the group, which include the Chinese government and also other government-related entities. The reason that I am talking about this is because I think what I'm about to tell you is something that I think a lot of people are quite interested in, and also at the same time, we talk about the research used for our different investment businesses as a public good, to be released to the general public and also to our institutional investors and to some of the clients of the group. So what I'm about to talk about is the SME situation in China. As you all very well know, the SME sector has been suffering massively since the pandemic, and we see this as a common issue across many countries around the world. And if there's one takeaway that I'd like you to get out of this presentation are some key facts and supported by big data analysis that we have done using natural language processing. And I think this is a different angle to probably many of the analyses that you've seen on the street. The conclusions are not that much different, but I think it's another validation of many of the things that we already know about the SME sector. Now, having said that, I'll just jump straight into some of the key findings. I think just to set a little bit of a context, one thing that I think is kind of catchy and interesting for everyone to know is something called 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in China when they talk about SMEs. So what does 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 mean? So SMEs account for 50% of tax revenue, 60% of national GDP, 70% of technology innovation, 80% of urban employment, and 90% of 90% of the growth in many of these cities that house the SMEs. So where do you see SMEs? You see them in many manufacturing industries as well as service industries, and we see in China the same thing that we see in globally in many countries. The SMEs in the services industry have been most heavily impacted by the pandemic. And as we look at different provinces in the country, we'll see very marked differences based on the economic structures of each province. So for example, we see that SMEs in Zhejiang province, which is also the home of Alibaba, and there's a huge technology cluster there. They're actually the only province that actually has seen growth in this sector. Whereas if you go to another province, which everyone knows, Hubei province, the SME sector has been most severely hit. Another province that I think people don't talk about is Shanxi province, which is known for its metals and mining industry. This one also has been hit. And you can see that across China, there are very different flavors of how SMEs have been impacted. And what is also very interesting is that because of this impact, their unemployment figures across the country are quite different. And many SMEs rely on migrant workers. So there are about 275 million migrant workers in China. Where they work is not where they're from, hence they're called migrant workers. And we are increasingly seeing unemployment numbers go up across the board. Having said that, in One Connect, one of our digital businesses in Ping An Group, we conducted a survey of SMEs to understand how severe was the problem. And we found out that 80% of the SMEs do not have enough liquidity, have only enough liquidity to survive in the next 6 months. After 6 months, liquidity issues become a solvency issues. So as you can see, probably a few months from now, we may see headlines and I think probably some defaults of well-known SMEs. And SMEs here, I'm not talking about typical mom and pop, old-fashioned industry. Here, we're also talking about small, medium-sized companies that happen to be Fintechs, many technology companies in China. So a few months from now, we do expect to see probably some high-profile names going underwater as a result. So what has the government done? In our advisory work to the government, we've made various policy recommendations, and I think that our recommendations and recommendations of other institutions can be summed up in 3 parts. The first part is, I think, early on in the pandemic, the government's focus and the policy recommendations around how to control the pandemic and also maintain supply in the economy. So it was important at the time, this was already several months ago, to maintain the supply side of the economy and get that up running as soon as possible. The second part is then focuses on how do we actually get people to come back to work? So what they call resumption of work. And this has been a focus since early February. So after the extended Chinese New Year holiday, most of the major corporations and also to the extent possible, SMEs were asked to bring their workers back to work. This has been, I think, successful relatively, but still, I think, we all know that only getting the supply side of the economy does only so much. I think the real question is, how big is the demand and how will the collapse in demand recover over the next few months and over the next year or so? I think we'll answer the question about how the size and the shape of the recovery will look like. So what we have done in my group is to analyze all the policies that have been released to the public by the government in speeches, in interviews that are written in text, and we've done a natural language processing analysis to understand how supportive government policy has been across those 3 parts of the policy plan. And we used NLP to search for keywords. For example, in part 1 of the policy recommendations and measures announced, we searched for words like medical supply, materials for disease, daily necessities, words like that. And in the second part, we search for words like back to work, work resumptions, a lot of synonyms as well, to understand how intensive the push was. And then in the third part, we looked for words like global economy, macroeconomic recovery, and things like that to understand how supportive the government policies have been and how much we believe there has been implemented. And this is an assumption that what has been said or written has been followed up with actions. Now, having done this analysis, I think the conclusion is this NLP analysis showed that what has been said has been largely validated and implemented, meaning. And I think what's very interesting here is that, and I think a lot of the media outside and inside of China have already captured that the government has been very cautious about stimulus, fiscal stimulus, and also easing monetary policy. And as some of you very well know, China has a huge leverage problem, and there has been a deleveraging process going on. So getting leverage back up is a challenge. So there has to be a fine balance, making sure that any stimulus plan and any lending support actually do go to the targeted segments. And we also see that this is a challenge in many other countries outside of China. So having said that, one of the observations that we also made is that the government has been very focused on traditional financial institutions to support the SMEs. And we know that a large number of them also use Fintechs. So One Connect, one of our companies, has many SME clients, and so do the Fintechs of our competitors. Their primary clientele in the corporate space is SMEs. So we do believe that if there is an additional measure that the government should take, it is to use Fintechs to get the lending out to the targeted segments. This is an area that we are discussing with the government to do more. And we also see the same in the US, seeing a lot of Fintechs step up to the plate to provide support to small, medium-sized companies in the country. So that's all I have to say. I'm very happy to send our report. We have an English language report to anyone who's interested after this conference. So please do let the Smartkarma folks know if you're interested in receiving our report. We're very happy to send to you and take any questions now. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Sohee. I think one of the most interesting things I found from your chat just now was regarding the unemployment in China.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned that unfortunately the timing of this COVID pandemic was just after the Chinese New Year holidays.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out how many people, by your estimation, have actually managed to go back to their workplaces, because are people still effectively stuck at home? Because some of the data we've seen in terms of transportation within China is still pretty low down. So I'm wondering how many people have actually made it back to their places of work.
In the major municipalities, the rate is very high. According to the data that we have, and this is not covering all municipalities, but some of the major municipalities in the country, it's 90% plus, and definitely in Shenzhen, where Ping An Group is based, we see a very high back to work rate. Having said that, I think this is based on what is trackable, right? And why is this trackable in urban areas much more than rural areas? Obviously, as you can very well imagine, in rural areas, there's the tracking mechanism, I think, is not in place. So just to give you an example, within Ping An Group, since pretty much everybody was asked to come back to work after the Chinese New Year holiday, and people above a certain level in the organization were all asked to return to work no matter what. So everybody was sitting in the offices at a certain level and up in the organization. And then by end of February, about 95% of the people were back. And this is a huge company, and all of this data was tracked internally. And we know that from our discussions with peers and also discussions with the government, in the large corporates in China, this has been very systematically tracked, and these statistics have been discussed with the local governments. So in the major municipalities, this has been happening. So I think within the for bigger companies, the back to work rate has been high for tracking, and also just to mention, most of the big companies made preparations for people to return to work by providing healthcare and protective equipment. So, for example, in my company, we all had to make sure that we had a mask per employee per day. So you can imagine how much work people had to do in the background to secure those masks for everybody. Otherwise, we couldn't open up. That was the rule. So, but I think in the case of SMEs, as I just mentioned, this kind of tracking mechanism, it doesn't exist. And also, I think the kind of resources to acquire protective equipment or healthcare, I think also is quite difficult. So the back to work rate has been lower. And obviously, because many of them employ migrant workers who return to their hometowns during Chinese New Year, many of them simply just couldn't get enough people back to work. And I think that's the reality. So, and as some of these businesses were forced to shut, and I think that's how the unemployment figures in many of these smaller companies shot up. And, I think, it depends on how long you believe this situation will last. And definitely, I think there's a concerted effort to make sure these people go back to jobs and those jobs exist. But I have to admit, based on our own observations, it's a difficult situation, like as you see anywhere else.
Yeah, understood. Thank you for that. I think another interesting thing you mentioned is, by your estimation, 80% of SMEs have liquidity for the next 6 months or so.
Yes.
I'm trying to get a sense for why that might be the case, or rather, 6 months seems quite a bit further away from what I would have expected. So just trying to get a sense of what are SMEs doing to get liquidity at this time, at this point in time. Are they relying on their local banks? Are they relying on fintechs? Are they, what are they doing? Because revenues kind of dried up for a lot of them, I'd imagine.
So they are getting support from their local banks. So if you look at the different types of banks in China, and you can classify them in different ways. One category is the small, medium-sized banks in urban areas. We believe that with the government support, because there was an additional 6 trillion of liquidity shot to the institutions, there is lending capacity in these financial institutions for the SMEs. So that's one area of support. Also, I think local governments have been very supportive, providing subsidies and providing other healthcare and social safety measures as to the extent possible. And again, the situation is very different city by city. So there have been measures like that. And I have to say, for the One Connect survey, that doesn't cover the entire population of SMEs in China. So I think it's just one kind of flavor of what we see. 6 months seems like far off, but if you start counting the clock from end of January, already half of that time has passed. So, so it's not really that far off.
Understood. Sorry, I thought this was more recent than January, but that sounds a little dire. Okay. I also wanted to check if you've done any studies in terms of sector recoveries and how they're doing. I remember looking at the report you had regarding how the medical supplies industry has grown rather quickly and capacity is kind of blown up there. I'm trying to get a sense for how other sectors have done, and if you've got any surveys or findings based on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm gonna tell you what you already know. I think companies that have digital businesses with a large reach and platforms to actually keep many of these clients engaged and transacting on their platforms have done very well. Those who are not as well digitized, I think, are suffering. So these so-called like traditional brick and mortar, they're suffering, especially if you're in the services sector. So, I mean, this is, I think, very common across many countries. I think the part that's probably kind of more interesting is that the digital transformation in China, I think, was probably going at a much faster pace than in many countries, and the penetration of digital tools in everyday life has been much higher in China than in other countries. So what this pandemic has done is to actually accelerate that trend even further. So what we do see coming out of this crisis is that across every sector, the companies that have proven track records of digitizing successfully and also have a plan forward about how to accelerate this will come out of this crisis better. Others that don't will fall behind, and some of them won't survive. So what we're going to see is a very interesting place, I think, in 2, 3, 4 years' time, where there's going to be a market difference for, between companies that have accelerated digitization and successfully digitized versus those who have not. And this is a common theme across every sector. On what you just mentioned on the medical device industry, this is not traditionally a digitized area. This is an area that the government is pushing to digitize. So one of the efforts that we have observed in our discussions with the governments in various municipality and provinces is that they are pushing these SMEs in particular to get onto online platforms. It's I think a national push. It's going to be a national push soon. So across sectors, we should expect a lot of support from the government to digitize. And again, not everybody's going to come along. And if you don't come along, I think it's going to be even tougher to survive in the next couple of years.
Understood. Thank you. I think you also mentioned that you and the group kind of make policy recommendations to the government. And I think you've mentioned that you've done some work on the supply side reform because that was a priority at the beginning. What about the demand side? Are there any policy prescriptions, and what do you think is necessary to kind of get the consumer going once again, which although it seems like consumption has recovered, we've seen auto sale numbers have as weak of a recovery as one can expect. But what about other aspects of consumption?
I think this is the unresolved issue and going on at the moment about how we this is an export-driven country, and everybody, pretty much who's buying from China is in its own pandemic. So the global demand has collapsed. So the question becomes, how do we revive domestic demand to help the recovery? And domestic demand, I mean, you can't force people to buy durable goods. I mean, if you have a refrigerator, you're not gonna tell them to buy a refrigerator again, right? So I think there's I think it's very hard because you can't force people to do things. I think on the supply side, as I mentioned, by rigorous tracking and supportive government policies and measures taken by many corporates, it was possible to get people to return back to work and have good results. But I think on the demand side, it's trickier. It's hard to get to people to open up wallets unless you have additional fiscal stimulus or monetary easing, which again is constrained by high leverage in the country. So it has to be done very carefully. It's not an easy problem, and I think we should all watch what the government is announcing and is doing, and I think that's probably a good indication of where things may go.
Understood. Thank you. I think another thing you mentioned in terms of a policy prescription is getting fintechs more involved with lending. Could you kind of walk us through what has been done so far and what you envisage as next steps for on this front?
Yeah, I mean, on this front, I think, look, I'm a foreigner, so I was surprised that this was not really actively promoted in the country, using fintechs to direct lending to SMEs. And I think, there are two issues. One is that, if you're a fintech and you're underwriting credit for an SME, you like any other financial institution, that your loans, the quality of your loans is good as the quality of the companies. So it's very hard, I think, to lend to companies that are going to suffer. So as a fintech with limited resources, and limited balance sheet, it's very difficult because it's going to directly hit your P&L and balance sheet. So that's one problem. The other problem is, I think, and this is the other problem is something I think that could be resolved over time is I don't think fintechs were actively promoted by the government or within themselves. They didn't really actively promote themselves as a tool for SME lending. I think that's partly related to the first reason that I mentioned. Second is, I think, without like support from the government that there'll be a backstop there'll be a backstop to the lending, it's going to be very hard to lend in large amounts. It's going to and I think without some kind of policy measure, it's going to be difficult to leverage fintechs as much as we would like to have it seen. And if there's one place where fintechs could actually provide material support, it is in China above any other place.
Got it.
Yeah.
Let's see. I think you mentioned the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Yeah.
I wanted to check if you've got any other interesting findings like this that were probably unexpected. This is very catchy, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, so when my team told me, I was like, wow, this is interesting. There's so many numbers related acronyms in China. I'm failing to keep up. This is one of them, which I found very kind of fun. I don't know, there are lots of things like that. I mean, to your question, are there any other things like this? I don't know. I guess it's the people who write the reports who make things up like this.
Got it. All right. Let's see. In terms of questions, yes. I think one thing you did touch on was in terms of the differences in recovery by province. I was wondering if you've got any recommendations, say by province or to provincial governments directly, in terms of what they can do to kind of get their economies going a little more than they already have. Again, I think everyone understands that this is a extremely difficult time, but I'm just trying to get a sense for as the leading financial institution in China, what might some of those recommendations be to the government?
I think, by and large, the policy recommendations are same across the board, except that they're different flavors because the structure of the economy is very different from province to province. So I think, the main point is what everybody knows, that we need to have more fiscal stimulus and more monetary easing. But unlike some neighboring countries like Korea, for example, there's not, this is a very highly leveraged country to start with, and I think the room for further fiscal support and monetary easing, I think monetary easing is probably better, is going to be very challenging. So I guess other priority has to be deprioritized. For example, how are we going to solve the leverage issue while getting funneling credit to the right places? And I think longer term, one way to resolve this is to make market discipline work and let market discipline play in China. But I think as a controlled economy, it's challenging. So there's no easy way out. However, I can say that having watched this country for almost 20 years now, the last time this country was in a crisis, this was when I was back in Hong Kong. I was still in Hong Kong, and this was about 14, 15 years ago. There was a credit crisis, and there were a lot of bulls and bears, and I think the bears had a very strong argument why the country's financial services system was going to collapse from a situation not very dissimilar to what we have today. But the country managed to grow out of that credit crisis because the rest of the global economy was strong and they could export their way out of growth. I think in this situation, that's not the case. So the recovery will be determined by not only what's been done domestically, but also what's been done internationally in many other countries, particularly the countries that buy Chinese goods and services. So I think,
I'm sorry. I think we're coming up on time. I'm getting pushed out here. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak at Insight 2020. And I think we're on our way to the next session. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much.